Can you hear me all right? Yeah, you can. It's great when they remind you to turn off the phone, because the worst thing would be if I forgot to turn off my phone. It would be really embarrassing. Okay, so hello. It's really nice to be here and to be able to talk to all of you. I'm going to start with doing a small introduction of myself. My name is Albertina. I used to study here. It was a long time ago, back in 2007, 8, around that time. And I studied game design and science here, and that's partly why it's so fun to be back here and see familiar faces and new faces and all your games, and I'm super impressed. So I'm just going to introduce myself and try to be quick about it. So I studied here, and then I tried to make a studio of my own. It went really shit. And then I went to Iceland to make some spaceships. That was kind of fun. Although I realized that I didn't want to be a game designer, and that I was better at other things. I went down to Skåne to work with Southend for a little bit, and then I came back to Stockholm to work a little bit with Paradox. And that's when I also started to realize that I wanted to work with leadership and project management more than I'd been doing before, because I started out as an illustrator and then as a game designer. I worked with a diversity initiative with the Swedish games industry called Diversi. We also have representatives from Diversi here, Kim Ava. If you want to know more about that, you should definitely talk to her. She is absolutely awesome. I've also worked with indie games, aside from AAA. I was for a while project coordinator for Lionbait Studios and Reign of Reflections. This is a screenshot from that game. But nowadays I work as a consultant, so I don't only work with the games industry. And, you know, we have challenges in the games industry when it comes to leadership and process development and things like that. And I felt like I need to go outside the games industry as well in order to gather, you know, this sort of cross knowledge from different industries and try and bring it together to also take that knowledge back to the games industry. And that is partly why I'm here now. So Arkatay is actually the consulting firm that I work for now, and I work with companies within the games industry and outside. I also play a lot of games, mainly role-playing games in Dota 2. I really don't have time to play anything else, except when I'm here, of course, then I play all of your games. That's it. All right, so let's go to the topic at hand, which is leadership and inclusive leadership. I'm going to start out by showing you this picture. Does anybody know who this woman is? Anybody recognize her? I see one. Okay, that's good. Does anybody have an idea what's going on in this picture? I see one. Great. Then I'm going to show you a little bit what's going to happen here. And I did buffer it before. That is very strange. That's not what I see on my screen, but never mind that. Okay.
Hi, camera. I've got a face. Can you see my face? No glasses face? What about my hair? But back to my face. You can see her face. What about my face? Well, I've got a mask. Can you see my mask?
Okay, so move on to the next slide. Doesn't want to. Okay. So this woman is called Joy Buolamwini, and she works for MIT, and she does a lot of research on something that she refers to as the coded gaze, which basically means that when you are working on something, in her case, it's specifically AI, because that's her main topic of research. It's important to have also a diverse team around you to provide you with different angles and maybe fill in the gaps that you might miss out on yourself if you have a very homogeneous team. And with this example, she is using a really big facial recognition software that has a data set. it has been grown on a data set that basically only includes white people, and that is why when somebody with a brown or black face or sits down in front of it, it doesn't recognize them as a person. So when she's working with software, she has to wear a white mask, because otherwise it doesn't actually recognize that she's a human being with a face. Why does it matter then to have a diverse culture? Does it have an impact on your studio culture, and why is it good to be inclusive? Let's talk a little bit about that. So different perspectives will offer you more angles to deal with issues and challenges, so you get a more complete view of the thing that you're working on. And researchers also say that it fosters innovation and creativity, because you have a greater source of knowledge to draw on when you try to solve problems and things like that. There's also a lot of research that shows that diverse groups can even outperform experts, because they have an ability to think outside the box for problem solving, which makes them really effective. There's also quite a bit of economical incentive. I know that there's a lot of text in this slide, but basically companies that are in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns above the respective national industry medians. We can also see here that for women it's slightly lower, but it's still an increased result for performance, and also that the companies that are in the bottom quartile for both gender and for ethnicity diversity, they're less likely to achieve above average financial returns, and that means basically that they're not only lower, they are actually lagging behind. In the US, you can see that racial and ethnic diversity has a greater impact than gender diversity. We're not really sure about why, but it might be because some initiatives have already been done in terms of gender diversity, which is why the impact is lower, but it's still a positive impact compared to non-diverse groups. There's also a lot of research that supports that you have a greater ability to attract and keep your talent with a diverse and inclusive culture. Things like challenge or salary are great for attracting millennials. That's us, most of us in here. But what actually keeps them is feeling happy and comfortable in their workplace and feeling like they belong. And a diverse workplace is part of making that happen. Innovation and well-being, they go hand in hand. So what we also see is that the more included employees feel, the more innovative they become, and they become more engaged with their job. They go above and beyond to support their team and to help them perform and to meet work group objectives. Another thing that I think about a lot is social corporate responsibility and individual responsibility is becoming a bigger and bigger part of our everyday discussion and our everyday lives. And it's important for PR reasons, but it's also the fact that we're standing at the precipice of great technological advancement, and I think AI is a great example of that. And if we don't take care to think about how we approach these hugely impact technologies that are going to shape our future, we might inherit cultural stigmas or limitations just because we miss some perspectives that we forgot to include in the work that we do. And I think the coded gaze is a really good example of that. So let's get a little bit more down to earth and talk about the kind of challenges that you might see in your everyday life. This is something that many of you probably have run into. I'm pretty sure that all of you have. And some challenges that can make inclusiveness harder to achieve are, for example, domination techniques. Here are some practical examples of those. To make somebody invisible by, for example, excluding them from a conversation. Maybe you don't look at them, you look at somebody else when you speak, or you just don't give them the space to talk in a situation. To ridicule them. Maybe if somebody is saying something or you're talking about something that you find important, somebody just, they leans back a little bit and laugh to themselves. That's a way of demeaning and ridiculing somebody else, and it takes away from your status in the group. Withholding information is also really common, and it's something that people usually don't do intentionally. When they do, it's kind of mean, but for example, maybe there is a meeting being held that concerns you and the work that you do, but you're not included. Many game designers in the industry will relate to this. I'm sure many of you can relate to this as well. Double bind, it's the kind of situation, if you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, because you already have a negative stigma attached to you for some or other reason, and people are just blaming you for things because they need somebody to blame. Shaming is also pretty common. An example of that is, for example, if you go to your boss to say, well, I feel sexually harassed by so-and-so, and they say, well, maybe you shouldn't wear that short skirt or whatever it is. It's basically your fault. Another thing that is really common that can also be something positive is something called the Pygmalion effect. And what it means is that people are going to act on what you expect from them. If you expect the best from them, if you expect somebody else to be amazing, they're actually more likely to be amazing. And the same actually goes the other way. If you expect the worst from somebody, you are more likely to get the worst. I don't have a reference for this because this is a really common and well-known phenomena. You can Google Pygmalion effect if you want to know more about it. There's also something called the halo effect, which basically means that the more attractive somebody is, the more positive is your attitude going to be towards them. And how does this play in? Because these things can be positive, but if you play in things like unconscious bias, where social stereotypes are guiding you in how you perceive other people, you have preconceptions that you maybe have been brought up with that you don't even think about, that is going to shape your expectation of somebody. It doesn't have to be, it can be subtle, It can be small things that affect what you expect from somebody. Just, maybe you lower the bar just a little bit for some or other reason. And this still can have an effect on the person that is being targeted. And it's also really a very supported research fact that certain situations make this behavior more likely to happen. So if you're in a stressed environment where you feel exposed, where you feel vulnerable, or you don't feel comfortable, in a stressed environment, for example, this is more likely to happen, which is another reason why it's pretty good to try and foster an inclusive culture where trust is the basis for what you do in your studio or organization or group. Something else that is really common is something called monocultures. Monoculture is a term that derives from agriculture. It's when you farm only a specific piece of land over and over with the same type of crop, which eventually leads to the earth being depleted and you can't farm there anymore. And there are also groups that are very, very dependent on defining the world as us and them. For example, we can't take in more immigrants because they're going to destroy our way of life, blah, 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 all that shit. And so on, There's all these challenges that we encounter in our workplace every day, and there are different ways to handle them. And if you're in a leadership position, you're going to have more opportunities to actually direct the way these situations will be handled and to try and steer them in a positive direction, which will make you more profitable and more, welcoming. So let's talk a little bit about leadership. People define leadership in different ways. I would be really interested to know a bit more about what leadership means to you and what good leadership means to you. And so feel free to think a little bit about what abilities or behaviors do you really appreciate in somebody that you have had around you that was in a leadership position. And we can maybe talk a little bit about that after I'm done with the presentation. Leadership and management are not the same things. They're both needed. A leader is somebody that you want to follow, and you do so instinctively. It's somebody that ensures that we are doing the right thing. We're doing what is needed to get this ship to the port. A manager is somebody that has an official mandate to make decisions, create structure. They have an official role. They are your boss on paper, so on and so forth. And they are also needed, but they are not necessarily that leadership figure that you need to have around you. In an ideal situation, probably your manager would be both and have both these traits. Also, leadership is somebody that everybody encounters. You need to lead yourself. You need to make decisions for yourself that are healthy. You know, what are you supposed to prioritize? What are the most important to do right now? What can I delegate to somebody else? If you don't trust the people around you, it's going to be harder for you to delegate, and you're going to end up becoming an overworked bottleneck, which is also why leadership for your own sake is really important. And, you know, there are everyday situations where you have an opportunity to step in as a leader. And with the teams that I work with, I always encourage them to, you know, step into that role and say something if they have opinions, if they can help or support somebody else or direct them, or just, you know, speak their mind about something, especially if they disagree with me. I used to encourage that because I think that is part of what makes you successful as a team, positive and negative critique. I'm going to show you a model that I really, really like that is called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Has anybody seen this before? A couple of people, yeah. Awesome. That makes me happy. So what you see here is a pyramid, and it brings up the 5 most sinful, worst things, usually, that can happen in a team. And if you're a game developer, you are going to work in teams sooner or later. That is almost always true. This is a pyramid for a reason. The things that are at the bottom are something that you build on to reach the next level, so to speak. And trust is the foundation of successful group and teamwork in general. If you don't have trust in your group, if people are not allowed to feel vulnerable, it becomes really, really hard to deal with conflicts. And conflicts is something that you need to move on to the next level, where people have they have sorted out their differences and reached, you know, agreement and consensus on how to move on. And once they have done that, they can start working as a team properly. There's something called forming, storming, norming, and performing, which is basically a model for how teams develop. Almost all teams develop like this. And as soon as you get a new person into your team, this cycle is going to start over. The forming part is where you are insecure, you don't know that much about your teammates, you probably are not going to insist on your strongest opinions immediately because you want to see and check out the others first, and you don't feel safe in that environment. Once you start feeling safe, that is when you start bringing up things like, well, I think it's more important to do this than that, or I think this is how we should solve a problem. And you will never be able to handle that phase if you don't have the basic trust in your group. This is super duper important. And some teams never exit the conflict stage. They just stay there. And, you know, that's not how you want to spend your life and work. Lack of commitment is also something that is one of the basic sins for teamwork. But usually commitment comes after you've dealt with the main conflicts. So when you get the commitment, you get the buy-in from everybody that this is what we want to do. This is our focus. This is our goal. Once you have the buy-in, you can also hold people accountable for the work that they do. If you don't have them on your side, you're never going to be able to trust them to perform or understand what it is that you want them to do. And this is also really common. It's about managing expectations, for example. I have been in a situation where somebody in my team delivers something to me that it doesn't live up to par. It's not good enough, or it's not what I think we agreed upon. As a leader, I have a responsibility in that situation because, for one, maybe I didn't get the buy-in from this person properly. Maybe I was not good enough in communicating what I wanted, or maybe they just misunderstood, or maybe they need to get better at their job. It doesn't really matter. You can still acknowledge the work that they put in for what they did. If you don't, you risk ending up in a negative feedback loop where they keep making the same mistake, and you show it to your art director and they're like, no, and you show it again and they're like, no, this is not good enough, this is not the right thing. This is also really common. It is perfectly okay to somebody to say, this is not what we're looking for, but I really appreciate the effort you put into this. So that's something that is really, really easy to forget. And this is also about accountability, holding somebody responsible for living up to the treaty, the bargain, the idea that you had to begin with of what you're supposed to do. Also, then finally, actually caring for the results and attention to results. So if you can't hold people accountable for what they do, it's really hard to achieve the results that you want, right? It's kind of impossible. So how does this tie together with inclusive leadership? You might ask yourself. We can take a look at the next slide. And don't forget that trust is the basis for this pyramid. There is a research study called Inclusive Leadership, The View from 6 Countries, which is a global analysis from Catalyst that researches the effect of inclusive leadership traits and how it affects groups. Inclusive leaderships is better at building trust, and they create a more innovative and dynamic workplace. And what you see here are the main traits that are taken directly from this study that was the most appreciated from the members of these teams that were part of the study. So you have empowerment, that is, you enable feedback in the group. Feedback also requires trust, because if you don't trust people, then you won't dare give the feedback. Accountability, again, we just talked about that, right? We know that that is important, and why. Courage. As a leader, to have the courage to say what you think and stand by your ideas, lead by example. Don't tell somebody to do this or that and don't live up to that yourself, for example. Don't tell somebody to never be late and then show up late yourself. It's going to just completely destroy the sense of trust that your team members have in you. And if you know that you can't show up on time, establish flex times instead. Make sure that you promote that environment that both you and your team can exist within and work in. Humility is also important, the ability to admit mistakes. If you as a leader can admit mistakes, it also means that your team is going to be able to admit mistakes to you. That is okay to make mistakes. Mistakes are one of the things that makes us learn faster. The faster we make mistakes, the sooner we're going to learn. And if you had Jacob as a teacher, he has a saying where you do the rapid prototyping, and he goes, well, fail fast, fail faster. And that's the reason for that. The sooner you fail, the sooner you're going to learn what works, right? So let's talk a little bit about practical techniques. When you start out the team, it's important to start out by building trust, and there are a couple of ways that you can do that. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that. Oh no. Crap. Sorry. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk about these in order. Feedback, ground rules, managing behaviors, and one-on-one meetings. And these, I hope, can give you an idea of how you can start working on these things to be preemptive, nip problems in the bud, and maybe avoid ending up in a dysfunctional team. And again, this is not only for people that are in a specific leadership position. Everybody should be accountable for, creating a positive work environment where people can actually perform. Trust is the basis for all of this for several reasons. Trust allows people to show their vulnerabilities in a team. For example, it allows them to not be ashamed of differences in skill. And if we know that somebody sucks at something or isn't, they need to develop and become better, then we can do something about it. If we don't know, if they try to hide it and are ashamed about it, it's going to take longer before we can do something about it. Interpersonal challenges and conflicts that don't come up to the surface can be an issue. We want that to happen. Admitting that you made a mistake. Again, if you don't tell somebody that you made a mistake, it can have super bad consequences, and you can't do something about it if you don't know that it happened. But you need to feel comfortable enough to admit that you made a mistake. It also enables people to ask for help. So all of these things will allow you to learn faster and grow faster as a team and it's going to expedite the rate at which you excel and at which you will be able to perform. You can build trust in several ways. Opening up and getting acceptance for personal differences, for example. And if you have a diverse team, this is something that is also important to do. People might have different histories and different backgrounds, which also leads to different values and ideas about how to do things. Learning how to manage conflict and showing people that it's okay to think differently as long as you agree on how to actually execute something. Actively listening to each other, encourage your team to, speak up, and you listen when they have something to say, and you also show people that how you are a good listener. And if you're in a room of people, for example, and you see that somebody is not saying anything and contributing, maybe you can rise them up by actually asking if they have something to add. Maybe they don't, and that is fine, but you never know. They might have greatest idea that they're just sitting on and don't dare to share. Managing risks are also important. That's part of managing expectations also. So if you know that there's a risk of something to happen, talk about it early and try to have an idea of how you will solve it if it does come to happen. What else is there? Yeah, just encourage honest and respectful behavior. And there are a couple of ways also to get going with this. You can have check-ins at your meetings where people actually talk a little bit about how they feel about their work situation before you go on to talk about the things that you are to deal with in the meeting. You share strengths and weaknesses with each other. And you can also use behavioral profiling tools like Myers-Briggs, DISC, and things like that. If you do choose to use them, please remember that these are about behavior and not personality. So, if you have done these Myers-Briggs or Kersey tests, they are supposed to say something about your behavior in certain situations. It's not going to tell you everything about the person. Feedback. So feedback is a tricky thing. It's super important. It's tricky to give. It's tricky to receive. How do you go about giving feedback to somebody? As a leader, it's also important to have self-insight. As for most individuals, it's important to have insight, actually. And it's really hard to get self-insight if you don't get a response from other people, because there's always going to be part of your own personality that you won't be aware of, and you need other people to mirror you in order to understand it. So we need other people in order to achieve self-insight, and that is also why feedback is so important, and also giving feedback. But if there is no trust, it's really hard to encourage a feedback culture within your group. It's a really important management tool. And I recommend that you give feedback as often as you can. This 80-20 is a general recommendation. You don't have to keep it like that, but usually people are more open to taking in your feedback if you say something positive first. I know that it sounds cliche, but it actually works. So who cares if it's cliche or not? Science says that it works, so why not use it? Give feedback on actual behaviors, not on their personality. And especially if you're a manager, prepare your feedback in advance. Situation behavior impact is a way of dealing with feedback. And I usually tell people to divide their feedback into 3 specific steps. First, describe the situation where the observed occurrence happened. The more specific you are, the better. The sooner you do it, the better. Then you describe the behavior that happened. And actually, you should be like a video recorder. Don't say, you did this because you're stupid, or you did that because you don't know how to come in time to the office. Say, this exact thing is what happened. Then you talk about the impact it had on you. When this happened, you did X. This made me really stressed out for so-and-so reason. Or this made it so I missed my deadline because this happened. Or this made me feel really sad or upset. Or I feel like you don't listen to me. Just talk about yourself. In general, 1/3 of your message should be about what the other person did, and the rest is about how you feel about it. Why? Because the more you tell the other person about how they felt or why they did something, the more defensive they are going to be. And they're going to start thinking about, yeah, but so-and-so, they're going to think about reasons and excuse themselves and so on. The more open you leave it for them to interpret what you say, the more they're going to question. They're going to question themselves and think about, why did this happen? Why did I do this? So by talking about how it impacts you, you allow for them to figure out their own situation and why it happened and why they did what they did. Here are some practical advice for giving feedback in general. Give it as close in time to the event as possible. Studies say that the longer you wait, the less the impact is going to be, partly because people don't remember. Don't wait. Do it preferably right away, as soon as you see the person again or whatever it is. Another thing that I usually do is I ask people if they're ready for feedback. And you know that I've walked around and talked a lot with you guys during these couple of days, and some of you have heard me ask you if you're ready to accept feedback. Do you want feedback? Because then you put the person in a mindset where, well, it's pretty hard to say no, right? Because you're supposed to be able to accept feedback, but it also makes them ready for it and prepared emotionally, mentally, and it's going to make the discussion easier. So, it doesn't hurt. Do you want some feedback? Are you ready for feedback? Maybe they say no. You can say no, thank you. I am in a really bad mood right now. This is not the right time, but maybe we can talk about this tomorrow. There's always ways to solve these situations. So don't be afraid to say no, but also don't, appreciate the fact that somebody wants to give you feedback because it's them showing you trust doing that. Feedback is a gift. By saying, we can talk about this at a later time. But it's okay to, have a bad day. Again, trust is key. If there's no trust in the group, feedback is going to be hampered and limited. And then you're not going to get to know yourself. You're not going to see the mistakes, so on and so forth. Be specific, prepare it if you can, and reflect on your own motives. Like, why am I feeling this? Maybe it's me that is reacting in a weird way. Also, don't forget the positive feedback. It has a really, really big impact. It's easy to take the positive things for granted. They're just there and it works. So we only talk about the things that don't work or doesn't work. That is really, really bad because you want to teach people what works. You want them to do it more. If you see a positive behavior and you actually, you notice on it, you say something, you give positive feedback, you're going to increase the rate and the chance of that behavior to happen again. So you need to talk about what works, what do we want to strengthen, and what things do we need to change. Avoid judging the individual. So talk about the action, not the person in general. Avoid words like always, never. How do you feel when somebody comes to you and says, why do you always do this? Why do you never pick up so-and-so? That doesn't set you in the mood to receive feedback, right? Just make you feel like, not this again. Don't hide your feedback between two good messages. That's something that people do sometimes where they're afraid of conflict. They also... sometimes people try to be ironic, to joke about it and so on, which makes it really difficult to react to. Because you actually have something to say, but you joke about it, and then the person is going to be like, well, is it a joke or are they serious? Is this actual critique or are they just joking around? This is also something that people do a lot when they're afraid or uncertain about giving feedback and when there's lack of trust in a situation. And it's one of my biggest pet peeves. And I have people that I work with that has this tendency, and they just, they say something to somebody, they just toss it out there. And I always feel like, no, stop. Is this something that you really, really mean, or is it actually a joke? Is there something in here that we need to discuss? Because, you're really welcome to share it. It's okay. So be attentive to those kinds of things. So it doesn't have to be directed towards you. It can be somebody else directing it towards somebody else. But there's something there, usually. Don't threaten people, Don't tell them that you're going to fire them or beat them up or visit them with a baseball bat or whatever it is. It doesn't work, I promise. It's a really bad idea. Receiving feedback is a little bit different. It's important to listen actively. I know I've mentioned this a couple of times. This is a whole science on its own. In general, I would say to listen actively. The main thing that people do, you're going to recognize this as well, is that they look at you, but you see that they want to say something. It's like the only thing they're thinking about is what they're going to say and what the reply is going to be to your feedback. Don't do that. Take in what the person is saying, then think about what you are going to say. It's going to make it a lot easier to communicate. Trust me. Also, asking questions is really good when you're receiving feedback, especially if you feel maybe that you don't agree. Don't go and say, no, that is not the case. Maybe you could say, well, how come so-and-so? And did you think about this? Or ask questions. Explore why they're giving you this feedback, because sometimes it might be an issue that they have themselves. Maybe you're aware of it, but asking the questions, it's going to allow them to think about them themselves instead of getting defensive or feeling like you don't listen to them. It signals that you are, in fact, listening. Being defensive, it's really common also. If somebody gives me feedback, I answer with saying, yeah, but you are doing so-and-so. Okay, that is fine. You have some feedback from me, but let's deal with this first feedback. Right? That's what we're talking about right now. And then, when we're done with that, we can deal with your feedback, because I want to hear it too. But it's not constructive to just go on and react with a defensive behavior in general when you're receiving feedback. Again, ask clarifying questions. And acknowledge that feedback is a gift. Here's another technique that I work with a lot. What time is it? Oh, I'm on time. Excellent. Ground rules. So this is actually a international best practice from the Project Management Institute technique. I don't like the name ground rules because it kind of implies that you're not allowed to act in a certain way, so and so. It sounds a little bit restrictive, but the point, anyways, is setting this the expectations for acceptable behavior within your group. And the thing is that every group has ground rules. Every group have behaviors that they find acceptable and that they don't. And when it's not specifically stated, it makes it harder for new people to understand them. It makes them harder to critique because they were never spoken out loud. You know, it's sort of something that it's just in the walls. It's just something that you're supposed to know. And when that is the case, it makes it really hard to have an opinion about them. So starting out making some ground rules, you can call them something else. It can just be a discussion to understand how people feel about working together. Allows people to specify things that they expect from each other, and it's gonna work preemptively to avoid miscommunication, misunderstandings, and so on. This actually applies for rules and processes in general, I would say. Make them stated, make them formal in one way, like write them down, talk about them specifically, check if people agree. It might be something that you think is not going to work, but the fact that you actually discussed it makes it easier for you to go back to that decision and critique it afterwards. If it's in the walls, it's going to be really hard for you to do that. I used to do this a lot when I played World of Warcraft, which I did for many years. And we had a really big raiding guild. It was like, we started out 5 people, ended up like 800. And we actually interviewed the people that were joining our guild. And we said, hey, nice to meet you, blah, blah, blah. We talked, and then we said, well, you know, in our guild, if you really want to join, it's not acceptable to do homophobic slander or transgender-phobic slander. It's not something that we accept. Are you okay with that? Are you comfortable with that? Usually they go yes, because they really wanted to join our guild, because we were doing really, really well. Server first, so on. But it also gave them a chance to say, well, this is not my thing. It gave us a chance to say, you know, if you want to act like this, go ahead. It's just that you can't do it here. Then you have to go somewhere else. It also gave them a chance to, you know, you get the buy-in. You know that they're aware what is expected. You get the buy-in from them. And if they actually go on and go on a homophobic rampage afterwards, you can go back to that. You know, do you remember that talk we had? This is not good. So it also actually makes it easier because you actually prepare them and set the expectations properly from the beginning. Involve the team defining the ground rules. If you don't involve the team, you're not going to get the buy-in. And then, you know, if you just as a leadership individual go and say, this is the rules, this is how we're going to do this, then people, they're going to sit there, and some of them are going to be like, oh yeah, this is okay. Some are going to be like, what an idiot. What the heck is this, you know? And they're not going to say it maybe because you're in a leadership position, but they're going to think it. And that's not going to help you in the long term. These are just some examples. This is actually the ground rules that we have in Arkatay. It's a bit funny because a lot of these things we just do. It's not something we talk about often. We don't have to remind each other about this often. It happens once in a while, and it sets the tone when new people arrive to our company. But it's not really something that we go and poke each other. I remember rule number 4. You're not following it right now. So it's just the way that the Arkatay chose to do it. Another technique is one-on-ones. And as a leader, you're going to end up in a situation where you have to manage behavior. It's a really, really big part of your job, and you need tools in order to do that. Understanding how to give and receive feedback, understanding the dysfunctions of a team, and understanding why trust is important is a big part of managing behaviors. Feedback is a way for you to do it, but it might not be that easy to set up situations that allow for it, and one-on-ones are really good to do that. You know, just walk up to somebody and say, "Hey, could we have a regular one-on-one with a check-in, maybe once a month or bi-weekly or whatever it is?" It doesn't have to be a manager that goes to an employee to say it. It can also be an employee that says, "Hey, I have a couple of things on my mind, some ideas, something I want to talk to you about." It can be to your boss or to a colleague. And one-on-one meetings are really good for that. If you're in an environment where, one-on-one meetings are not acceptable, where it's not acceptable for you to go to your boss and ask for a one-on-one talk, usually that's not a very good sign. And I know some places where that is not okay to do because the hierarchy is just so strong. Feedback is good to do in one-on-one meetings. You can do it with your co-colleagues as well. As a manager, it's something that I do regularly with everybody in my team. It takes up a lot of my time, but they enjoy it a lot, and I feel like I get a lot from it. I usually prepare beforehand a little bit, the agenda, and I usually let them talk first, ask them what they think is working, what do you want us to do more of, what do you want us to do less of, and then if I have some feedback for them, I take it usually in the end. But it also gives them a chance to talk to me, and it shows them that I am available for that talk. And if you're in a leadership position and your team feels like they can't approach you with critique, that critique is going to come up anyways, but you're not going to hear about it. Everybody else is going to hear about it because they are going to talk about it. If they're not coming to you, they're going to somebody else, right? And that is not a way either to promote a good culture. You don't want to be in that position because it's going to undermine your authority eventually. You need to be able to receive feedback. One-on-one meetings, management tool, maybe 10 minutes employee needs, 10 minutes project managers needs. I say PM because I usually work as a project manager. 10 minutes future work. What are we going to do about it? Actually, get action points. How are we going to make sure this happens? Don't forget that. That is really, really good. Always end your meeting with action points. Otherwise, you always risk people feeling like, we always sit in these meetings, but what are they for? It's just wasting our time. End with action points. It's a good general tip. Now I've been speaking for 50 minutes. And that was about it. Questions?
Okay, thank you so much for a very interesting talk. There's a lot of stuff that I want to take with me and deal with potential conflicts as well. To jump back to sort of maybe the first half of your talk when you were talking about the benefits of diversity.
Yeah.
So I think it was very interesting to hear about that, and also interesting to hear about how it can be financially beneficial to have a diverse group of employees or members of your team. But do you have recommendations for how to practically achieve that? Because I think that is a big question mark many times, that many people would agree, yeah, diversity is great, but how do we do that? Do we hire with particular ratios of who we involve? Like how do we get to this point?
Okay, this is a really tricky question, and there's a couple of ways to go about it. I think that from one, I think you need the self-insight as an organization, as a company. Recruitment is really important. It's something when I talk to industry, small or big, it doesn't matter. They always ask me how do we get the people in? We want to be diverse, but we don't know how. What should we do? And first look at yourself, look at the way you communicate. There's a lot of studies showing, for example, that it can be really specific small things. Like when you make an ad, if you have bullet points, you are less likely to attract female applicants. I do not remember why, but there are studies that show this. So, study yourself and how you work, I think is important. I also think that a lot of companies in general, especially if they're a bit new or immature, they don't work with strategy in an effective way. I think that you need to look at how you work with strategy and make diversity part of your long-term strategic goals. So it should be part of your vision. Then you have a talk about what goals you set that are concrete. They should be SMART goals. That is, they should be specific. They should be measurable, so on and so forth. They should have a set time for when you want concrete things to happen, and these goals should support this vision. And then you look at your everyday aspect and see what kind of drivers, like what actions do we need to take in order to achieve these goals. King I don't know if Rabbi is here, but he told me that that King has a goal to be 50-50 gender ratio by 2020. That is not a vision, that is a goal, because it's so specific. And then you talk about what do we need to do to make that happen. So, that is one way. I also think that you can look at diversity in many different ways. I usually talk about qualitative diversity and quantitative diversity. So King's goal with 50-50, that is a quantitative diversity. On a practical level, they know that they want 50-50. They know that they're going to be beneficial for them to achieve a more practical quantitative diversity. Quality is about going at a workplace where you feel like, I can talk about these issues and everybody will understand. Having people around you that are knowledgeable. For example, at my workplace, we're mostly men, but I feel like it's really easy to have these discussions with them, which makes me super comfortable, and it makes it welcoming for people who might be from a minority or don't conform to the general norm of the place and so on. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Feel free to ask me more about this afterwards. I can talk about it for days.
Hi, Albertina.
Hey,
thanks
man.
for a good talk. I was thinking more with the feedback back and forth. Is there anything special you should think about when there's a power structure involved as well? Of when you're giving and receiving feedback from a colleague, or when it's upwards or downwards?
Do you see yourself as from top down or from bottom up?
It depends on who I speak with. I mean, if I speak with colleagues, or if I speak with students, or my bosses, etc., is there something you need to think about specifically in what your position you're in?
Yeah,
I know there are, but would you like to elaborate on that?
So, what you're describing is really common for middle managers. They have to manage up and they have to manage down, and your team is expecting you to represent them when you manage up, and your managers are expecting you to represent their goals when you manage down. That is something that you need to handle, and it can be really, really tricky. I think all of the specific advice in the presentation will help you independent of who you're giving feedback, but that balancing aspect should also be something that you keep in mind when you manage up and down. And especially when you're managing down, I think it's super important to be a good listener and to work with trust, because otherwise you're not gonna get the effect that you want. You run the risk of the person, if the person sees you as being above you in some kind of power structure, you run the risk of them not saying, they need to be comfortable and feel safe enough to actually say, give you feedback back, and to actually, listen and take in properly what you're saying. So that's the advice I would give.
Thank you.
Thanks for your talk, Albertina. I have one question regarding the monoculture that you mentioned at the very beginning. Now, when we refer to that, we tend to refer to different countries, different mindsets, etc. But I would like to know how that would apply to work ethic, and specifically your drive to work in a specific way or to achieve a specific level of requirement. Would trying to search for people to join the company that work in a specific way, or rather with a specific work attitude, be considered monoculture, and what would be the potential downsides of such a thing?
That's a really, really good question. I don't feel completely expert enough to answer it in a really, really good way, but I will try. So I would say no. Looking for people to support a specific type of culture on its own is not automatically going to create a monoculture. For me, if we're not talking about political parties or whatever, and we scale it down to like a work group or a work team. What I would see as a monoculture is where, for one, the group identity is dependent on defining the us and them. This is how we do things. Those people over there at the other department, they're always late. They always, they take too long in the coffee room, so we can't sit there, so on. Complaining about others becomes part of the culture, and it becomes part of the identity of the group. And that's usually really, really destructive. And that's part of the downsides with a monoculture, that it's so important to identify what's wrong with everybody else, to heighten what is good about you, instead of inherently finding what is good about your group and also learning from the people around you. It can be really hard to have a monoculture in your company within a specific group, because everybody else is going to find it hard to work with them. It's problematic on many different levels. Also, typical signs for a monoculture is that if you're in this group, it's really dangerous to critique. If you act in a way, or that if you critique the group norm, you immediately risk being, frozen out, because you're threatening the group identity. And considering what we've talked about now, how trust is important, what we identify as dysfunctions in a team, how feedback is valuable for you to grow and learn and become better at what you do, it should be pretty easy to figure out how that can be destructive. So I think, having values and principles that you want people to understand before they join is fine. It's fine to have an idea what kind of culture you want, but it should be a conscious decision, and I would recommend avoiding monocultures for these reasons that I've said just now.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hello, Albertina. Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. My question is, in the trend in the IT industry at the moment is going to home office and distributed teams. And in my team's case, a few of us are going to study abroad in the next semester while continuing to work on our game. So despite the given tools such as video chats, do you see additional challenges occurring with this trend, or specific points you should focus on to grow a team culture with those challenges in mind?
So let me just check to see if I understood you correctly. You're going to have team members that work offshore, abroad.
Exactly.
And you want to build a good team culture anyways.
Yes. Also when it comes to the IT industry, where it's more going towards home offices.
Yeah. You have such good questions, all of you. I think this is a really tricky one as well, because it's becoming more and more challenging, or common, to work offshore and have like a digital team or a virtual team. There's a lot of research being done in this area that you can look up, and I can share with you afterwards probably. I have colleagues that are also a little bit better at this than I am, so I would love to share that. You should definitely poke me afterwards. It is trickier to make them feel included, making sure that you have the technology to support it, for example, video conferencing, where you can actually see their facial expression and so on. Maybe have a monitor in the same room where you're working, and show pictures of the people doing their things. Make sure that you include them in important decisions, or when you talk about if you want to talk about ground rules, for example, make sure you include them. Talk about it. What do you? It's also about this is really good, because I mentioned quickly how managing risk is important for building trust, and you can manage risk by talking about it. And say to your team, hey, I think this is a risk that when we're working offshore, that we might not, get the same culture, or everybody might not feel included. How should we approach this risk? Do we have different responses to this? Should we ignore it? That's a response. Should we do something specific about it? Having the tools to support working offshore, for example, with the monitors and video conferencing, that is a response to that risk. That is a typical risk response. So by talking about it, you come up with these ideas, and then you can act on them. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I had a question. It's a bit of a follow-up to the diversity question. You mentioned King as an example. They want 50% men and women.
Yeah.
And that's a goal in terms of equality of outcome. So do you think equality of outcome is more important than equality of opportunity in that case?
I don't think it's more important. I think there are many ways lead to Rome. I think it's important that you do a risk analysis. I'm really into risk analysis, by the way. You should be happy that this talk wasn't about that, because it would be several hours long. Anyways, I think you should do proper research. You can come up with ideas first. You see benefits of diversity in different ways. You want to go for it. You find different ways to approach it. You make the research and you consider the risks and the outcomes, and you should, King is a really professional company in many ways, and they are really good at understanding risk and defining, they have a business case for this. It's going to say, what are the long-term benefits for doing this? They're going to, if you ask the ones responsible for this initiative, they're going to have the answers for you. And so no matter what way you go, you should be able to have those answers. That's what I think.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So thank you so much. I'm going to ask you one last question that is really burning on my mind, and I think then we can take a little break before the next talk. And I'm not sure if this is something there is an answer for. So when we are looking at different factors along the lines of which we normally think about diversity, which is typically, oftentimes, also in the examples now, race, gender, maybe age,
and class.
Yeah, that is exactly the one that I've been feeling to be missing here. So, when we look at class, which I think is oftentimes maybe the underlying factor of many inequalities, or maybe at least a mechanism by which their reproduction continues quite often, how can we address that factor there? Because that is seems to be something that is so hard to look at or come at the point of where you employ someone in a company, because they have been suffering from not having this equality of opportunities for several, maybe two and a half decades already. So how do you address that? That we don't just start re-employing, people of different gender and color, but largely people who have still been advantaged from that perspective?
I don't know.
No, that's a hard one. And we're struggling with that, for example, as a university, right? So that would be something that we are thinking, how can we get kids to, or students that maybe come from other places?
For one, do what you do now. Ask the questions. Start talking about it. And then again, I think most of the things in my talk they're at a really practical level. I think they apply independent of what minority or underrepresented group you belong to, or independent of what's it called? Privilege that they might be missing. But it doesn't look at the bigger picture, It doesn't look at the way our society works, or, how do you even enable people to be in a position to apply for a job at your company? It's a really big social and societal question that I think we need to answer eventually. Yeah.
I just want to jump in with that one. I did a presentation at GLS about that, how we all talk about, especially in education, that we want to be more diverse. But what we mean is more diverse with people that have managed to get to education, so sort of diverse light. Yeah. If we want more diverse communities, we go to those communities and take education there. Valencia, 826 Valencia, initially out of San Francisco, has a pirate store, and at the back, English classes manned by professional writers, and now they have a whole bunch of these shops all over the place, bringing opportunities to unrepresented areas. We can do that, just take the education to the places where it's needed.
It's a little bit how you deal with other target group as well, isn't it? But yeah, that's a really good point. Take the education to to those communities.
So thank you very much. We went a little bit over time, but this was really an amazing discussion, and I wanted to hear the answer to every single of those questions. So I would suggest that we meet again 20 past, so that we have roughly 10 minutes to get out and get a little bit of oxygen before the second talk. So thank you so very much.
Thanks for having me.